And as I rushed back into the children's bedroom, that was the point. And I guess it was the chance that just had to be a gust of wind. And suddenly the curtains that were closed over just...
Absolutely, we can't be certain. You have to speak to those involved. We don't believe for 1 minute that they thought we were involved in Madeleine's disappearance. We think there was tremendous pressure to make the crime go away.
Well, it's been an absolutely fantastic response, Kirsty. Over 3,500 calls, texts and emails. Some really interesting new information, people in Prada Luz or in the area at the time.
Clothes, and that's one thing in hindsight, again, I think that's quite odd because tourists, when they're abroad, Brits abroad, would always have crop trousers or shorts or something, and he has sort of a big heavy jacket and trousers on.
Well, there are a number of really important lines of inquiry that we are following up at the moment. Lots to do, but this evening, Kirsty, what I'd really like to do is to thank the public for the huge and continuing help that they provided us.
It was just after 10 p.m. on a cool spring evening in Portugal. The streets of Praia da Luz were quiet, the ocean only a faint hum in the distance. A family strolled home from a late dinner, laughing softly, their footsteps echoing on narrow cobblestones. And then, in that fleeting silence, they saw him. A white man in his 30s, moving quickly, his arms full. In his embrace was a little girl with blonde hair, no shoes, and dressed in pale pajamas. She appeared to be asleep, or perhaps something more. The Smith family paused. Something about the scene unsettled them. It was too cold for a child to be carried without a blanket. The man held her not like a father, not with tenderness, but with a stiffness, a determination to get somewhere fast. Within seconds, he had passed, swallowed by the darkness, heading toward the beach. The Smiths continued walking, their unease growing. Only later would they realize just how chilling this brief encounter might be, because the girl they saw looked strikingly like a child whose face would soon be known across the world. Madeleine McCann. For years, the case of Madeleine's disappearance has been built around a very different timeline, one anchored by another supposed sighting, the Tanner sighting.
It's about probably 5'8" tall. He was taller than me, but not 6 foot. So between those two, he was wearing quite a lot of clothes, and that's one thing in hindsight. Again, I think that's quite odd because tourists, when they're abroad, Brits abroad, would always have crop trousers or shorts or something, and he had sort of a big heavy jacket and trousers on.
Tonight, we'll unravel why that assumption may have been wrong, and how the Smith sighting, ignored and buried for years, may hold the true key to understanding what happened after 9:15 p.m. on May 3rd, 2007. The story begins, as so many know, at the Ocean Club Resort. Before we analyze the suspicions in the case, please tell me where you saw this video from. I will read it all and spread it to the world. Madeleine McCann, a 3-year-old girl from England, was on holiday with her parents, Gerry and Kate, and her younger siblings. The parents dined each evening at the resort's tapas bar with friends, checking periodically on the children asleep in the ground floor apartment. On the night of May 3rd, Gerry checked on Madeleine at 9:05. She was still in bed, wearing pink and white pajamas, her favorite cuddle toy by her side. At 9:15, another friend, Jane Tanner, reported seeing a man crossing the street near the McCann's apartment. He carried a child.
You must just feel so helpless.
Suddenly a lot of doors began to close. You know, the UK government and the authorities kind of withdrew, and there was obviously doubt, you know, amongst sectors of the general public. And we really felt hampered then. And the hardest thing, the most upsetting thing for us was that obviously impacts greatly on the search for Madeleine. You know, we need people to be helping us, to be looking for her.
For the Portuguese police, who were desperately searching for clues, this became the basis of the investigation for many years. The public was told that Tanner saw Madeleine at the time the seizures were made. Campaigns were launched around it, but there was a problem with the evidence, later revealing that the man Jane saw was almost certainly not the kidnapper, but a holidaymaker carrying his child back from the night crash. This revelation shattered what many had believed for many years. If Jane Tanner's account was a tragic misidentification, then the entire supposed timeline would collapse. Madeleine may not have been kidnapped at 9:15.
And as I rushed back into the children's bedroom, that was the point. And I guess it was chance that just happened to be a gust of wind, that suddenly the curtains that were closed over just...
Which brings us back to the Smith family. Around 10 p.m., just 45 minutes after Gerry's last check, the Smiths were leaving Kelly's bar, heading toward their apartment. As they walked down a narrow lane, they noticed a man carrying a little girl. She was barefoot, dressed in light pajamas, her head slumped against his shoulder. The man walked briskly, eyes down, body tense. He carried no bag, no blanket, nothing that suggested comfort or care. At the time, the Smiths did not know Madeleine was missing. That news would break later that night. But when they heard, their memory of that strange figure became far more chilling. In statements to police, several members of the Smith family independently described the child as looking like Madeleine. The location of the sighting, less than 300 meters from the Ocean Club and heading toward the beach, only deepened the suspicion. 4 months later, Martin Smith, the family patriarch, was watching television. He saw footage of Gerry McCann descending the stairs of a plane carrying his young son, Sean. Martin froze. The posture, the way the child was held, even the gait. It was identical to the man he had seen in Praia da Luz that night. Smith was so disturbed that he contacted investigators, stating he was 60 to 80% sure Gerry was the man he had encountered. This moment created a storm of controversy. Gerry McCann had an alibi. He was at the tapas bar at the time the Smiths reported their sighting. Multiple witnesses corroborated his presence. Could it be that Martin Smith's memory, colored by media images, had betrayed him? Or did it suggest something more complex? That perhaps the timeline of who was where and when was not as clear as it had always seemed. For investigators, the implications were enormous. If Tanner's sighting was a red herring, then the window of opportunity for Madeleine's disappearance shifts forward, closer to 10 p.m. When Kate McCann returned to the apartment and discovered the unthinkable. Madeleine was gone, the window open, the curtains billowing, her bed empty. The focus then becomes the Smith sighting. A man carrying a child at precisely the right time on a route that made sense for an abductor moving quickly toward the sea. Years later, EFITs, based on the Smiths' descriptions, were released on national television, shocking viewers with their uncanny resemblance to known figures in the case. Yet, for reasons still debated today, the sighting was downplayed for years while the Tanner account dominated public attention. This shift in focus raises questions that remain unanswered. Why did the Smith sighting not receive equal, if not greater, scrutiny from the beginning? Was it because it conflicted with the narrative already taking shape? Was it simply lost in the noise of international media frenzy? Or was it sidelined because its implications were too explosive, pointing toward possibilities investigators were not ready to confront? The stakes in this case could not be higher. For the McCanns, the disappearance of their daughter became not only a personal tragedy, but also a media hurricane. They were hailed as victims, then vilified as suspects, then defended again.
Yeah, I mean, she's always still part of our life. There's photographs all around the house. Obviously, at this time of year, then We can't even have conversations that doesn't involve it. The kids know that we're doing our interview today. You know, the anniversary's coming up. So she is still part of it, but obviously...
The Portuguese police, criticized worldwide, struggled under the weight of international scrutiny. Every inconsistency in the timeline became fodder for speculation, and every sighting, real or imagined, added layers of confusion. But at the heart of all of this remains a haunting image. A man at 10 p.m. carrying a child who looked like Madeleine McCann down a street in Praia da Luz. That image, described by the Smith family, has never faded. And it's why many experts today believe the Smith sighting, not the Tanner sighting, holds the truest clue to what really happened that night. So what are we left with? A timeline that may have been wrong for years, a witness account that was overshadowed, and a case that continues to torment investigators, journalists, and the public. The disappearance of Madeleine McCann is not just a story of a child gone missing. It's a story of uncertainty, of human memory, of institutions under pressure, and of a family still searching for answers. 17 years later, the mystery endures. German authorities have identified a convicted predator, Christian Bruckner, as a suspect, though no charges have been brought. The McCanns continue to hope, while investigators continue to dig. But the haunting truth remains. A 3-year-old child vanished from her bed in a quiet seaside village, and the world has never been able to explain how. And perhaps the key lies not in what was seen at 9:15, but in what was seen at 10 Hunkig. A fleeting encounter on a dark street. A man, a child, and a silence that still echoes today. It was a warm evening on the Portuguese coast, May 3rd, 2007. The sun had long slipped beneath the horizon, leaving the streets of Praia da Luz bathed in the faint glow of amber street lamps. Tourists were still filtering out of restaurants. The ocean murmured in the distance, and behind the walls of apartment 5A, 3 small children lay asleep. Among them was Madeleine McCann, a bright-eyed 3-year-old with blonde hair and a smile that had already charmed the world. By the end of that night, she would be gone, and her disappearance would ignite one of the most haunting and divisive criminal mysteries of the 21st century. The McCanns were not alone. Kate and Gerry, both doctors, were vacationing with 7 friends who became known as the Tapas 7, a nickname tied to the Ocean Club restaurant where they dined almost every night.
And we hid her body. Well, when did she have the accident and died? Because the only time she was left unattended was when we were at dinner. So if she died then, how could we have disposed or hidden her body, when there was an immediate set? It's just nonsense. So, and if she died when we were in the apartment or fell and did, why would we cover that up?
It was meant to be an idyllic holiday. Sunshine, tennis, and laughter over shared bottles of wine. The arrangement seemed practical, almost casual. The children would sleep in their ground floor apartments, while the adults rotated in shifts to check on them. The distance between apartment 5A and the Tapas restaurant was only about 50 meters, a stone's throw. It felt close enough to be safe, close enough to convince themselves that nothing could possibly happen. But safety was an illusion. Apartment 5A, tucked on the corner of 2 intersecting roads, was the most vulnerable of the entire block. Its patio doors opened directly onto a public street, and its windows faced areas easily accessible to anyone. If an intruder wanted a target, this apartment was it. By 8:30 p.m., Madeleine was fast asleep, tucked alongside her younger twin siblings. At 8:40, Kate and Gerry joined their friends at the Tapas bar. The faint chatter of plates and conversation masking the quiet unease that would later consume them. The system of checks began at 9:05. Gerry walked back, slipping through the unlocked patio door to peek at his children. All seemed peaceful, Madeleine lying where she had been left. He closed the door behind him and returned to the table. 10 minutes later, Jane Tanner, one of the Tapas 7, left to check on her daughter. On the narrow street outside, she reported seeing something strange. A man striding purposefully, carrying a small child dressed in pale pajamas. She would later insist this was around 9:15, and that the sight burned itself into her memory. This observation, later called the Tanner sighting, would dominate the investigation for years. At 9:30, Matthew Oldfield offered to check on the McCann children, but his inspection was careless. He stood at the doorway, listened for sounds of sleep, and walked away without looking closely. He would later admit he never laid eyes on Madeleine. By 10 o'clock, Kate returned for her own turn. What she discovered was every parent's nightmare. The window was open, the shutters were raised, and Madeleine's bed was empty.
Well, there are a number of really important lines of inquiry that we are following up at the moment. Lots to do, but this evening, Kirsty, what I'd really like to do is to thank the public for the huge and continuing help that they provided us.
Panic set in. And within minutes, the apartment was packed with friends, staff, neighbors, anyone who thought they could help. But the damage was done in those crucial first hours. The crime scene was left in disarray. Fingerprints were faded, footprints were trampled, and potential evidence was lost forever.
Well, it's been an absolutely fantastic response, Kirsty. Over 3,500 calls, texts, and emails. Some really interesting new information, people in Prada Luz or in the area at the time.
The Portuguese police soon focused on the time frame between 9:05 p.m., when Gerry last saw Madeleine, and 10 o'clock p.m., when Kate sounded the alarm, a window of 55 minutes. And within that gap, Jane Tanner's sighting took center stage. To investigators, it was a lifeline, a potential glimpse of the person who took the child. Her account shaped the entire narrative. A stranger, slipping into the night, carrying a sleeping girl toward an uncertain fate. Yet this focus would come at a devastating cost. Other leads, including a second reported sighting later in the night, were pushed aside or ignored for years. The following morning, May 4th, the McCanns pleaded publicly for their daughter's return. Volunteers scoured the surrounding areas, and boarders were alerted. But behind the scenes, tension was brewing. Questions were raised about why the children had been left alone, why the apartment doors were unlocked, and whether the parents' decision had created the very circumstances that allowed Madeleine to vanish. As weeks turned into months, suspicions began to bend inward. Portuguese police, under pressure and criticized for their handling of the case, formally named Kate and Gerry McCann as suspects in September 2007. The theory was shocking, that Madeleine had passed away accidentally in the apartment and her parents had conspired to cover it up. For nearly a year, this suspicion shadowed them, amplified by media frenzy and a storm of speculation. But the evidence did not hold. By July 2008, the McCanns were cleared. Still, the damage lingered, their reputations entangled forever with the mystery of their missing daughter. For investigators, the Tanner sighting remained the axis around which everything spun. But was it the truth? Years later, detectives would suggest that the man Jane Tanner saw was likely another holidaymaker, one of the McCann's neighbors carrying his own child home from the creche. If that is true, then the 9:15 sighting was nothing more than a tragic coincidence, an innocent moment misinterpreted, one that diverted precious resources and attention away from other possibilities. The real window, then, may have been wider, darker, and more uncertain than anyone first imagined. And as doubts about the Tanner sighting grew, Other overlooked accounts, such as the Smith family's description of a man carrying a child closer to 10 p.m., began to gain renewed significance. But by then, years had been lost, and with them, countless opportunities to bring Madeleine home. The stakes only grew higher as the years passed. Every anniversary carried with it both remembrance and despair. Candlelit vigils were held, appeals were broadcast, and investigations were reopened, closed, and reopened again. Scotland Yard's Operation Grange was launched in 2011, offering hope of a fresh review. And yet, despite millions spent and leads pursued across Europe, the truth remained elusive. Even today, nearly 2 decades later, the case is unresolved. German authorities have named Christian Bruckner, a convicted predator with a dark history in Portugal, as their prime suspect. But without definitive proof, without Madeleine, the case remains trapped in limbo. Forensic evidence is thin. Witness accounts are clouded by memory and time, and a single question still echoes louder than all the rest. What really happened between 9:05 and 10 o'clock p.m.? On May 3, 2007, the story of Madeleine McCann is not only about a vanished child, it is about the fragility of trust, the cracks in human judgment, and the unbearable weight of not knowing. For Kate and Gerry, it is a wound that never healed. For investigators, it is a puzzle that resists resolution. And for the world, it is a reminder that sometimes the most ordinary evenings can splinter into tragedy, leaving behind questions that no amount of searching can fully answer. Madeleine's face remains frozen in time, 3 years old, smiling, forever waiting at the edge of memory. And until the truth of that night is uncovered, her story will remain one of the most haunting mysteries of our time.
Well, it's very important to us that the case has been reopened. And over the coming weeks and months, we're looking to develop further our relationship with the Portuguese police and authorities, and hoping jointly to work together in a focused and determined way to find out what has happened to Madeleine McCann.
At around 9:15 on the night of May 3, 2007, a narrow street in Praia da Luz became the stage for what would later be called one of the most infamous sightings in modern criminal history. A woman named Jane Tanner, part of the McCann's holiday group, claimed she had seen a man walking briskly across the road, cradling a small child in pink pajamas. It was only a matter of seconds, a fleeting glimpse in the darkness, but that single image would become the cornerstone of the early investigation into the disappearance of Madeleine McCann. And yet, less than an hour later, another family, walking home from a bar just a few streets away, reported a strikingly similar sighting. This time, 9 people saw it. They watched a man in his 30s, carrying a blonde girl in pale pajamas, her bare feet dangling, her head resting limply against his shoulder. That testimony, the Smith sighting, would be buried in obscurity for years, while the world focused on Jane Tanner's brief and contested account. 2 sightings, 2 timelines, 2 competing stories of the same night, and the chilling possibility that only one of them, if either, was real. Jane Tanner's sighting took place just after 9:15 p.m. She was leaving the tapas restaurant to check on her daughter when she walked down the narrow street outside apartment 5A. At that very moment, Gerry McCann was returning from his own check, stopping to talk with a fellow tourist named Jess Wilkins. Both men later insisted they had not seen Jane Tanner at all, nor had they seen any man carrying a child walk past them on that same stretch of road. This discrepancy has haunted investigators. How could Jane Tanner have walked within feet of Gerry McCann and Jess Wilkins on such a narrow road and gone completely unnoticed? And how could a man carrying a child have crossed directly in front of them without being seen. To the Portuguese police, this contradiction was alarming. Was the sighting real, or had Jane Tanner been mistaken? Despite the uncertainty, her account became the official foundation of the case. Police released sketches based on her description. A Mediterranean-looking man, 35 to 40 years old, around 1.7 meters tall, wearing beige trousers and a dark jacket, carrying a child in pink floral pajamas. It was a haunting match to the pajamas Madeleine had been wearing that night. For 6 years, the world chased the image of this man, believing he held the key to the mystery, but the flaws would not go away. Tanner had not seen the man's face. The sighting lasted mere seconds, and years later, Scotland Yard announced they were almost certain her sighting was not a person who took the child at all, but an innocent British holidaymaker carrying his own daughter back from the creche. In other words, the most famous sighting of the night may have been nothing more than a tragic red herring. Now, compare this with the Smith sighting. At around 9:50 to 10 p.m., the Smith family, 9 people in total, were walking home from Kelly's bar. They were spread out along a quiet street leading toward the beach about 500 meters from apartment 5A. As they walked, they saw a man emerge, moving down the middle of the street. He carried a small blonde girl, about 3 or 4 years old, her arms hanging limply, her feet bare, her light-colored pajamas glowing faintly in the dim light. The family's description was vivid and consistent. The man was white, in his 30s, around 1.75 meters tall with short brown hair. He wore beige trousers, the kind made of linen or cotton, and did not look like a tourist. The child he carried matched Madeleine's description almost exactly. Unlike Tanner, who had seconds of a side glance, the Smiths passed within feet of the man. They saw his build, his gait, the way he held the child, and the girl's strikingly vulnerable appearance. To them, this was not a brief shadow in the dark. It was a clear encounter. And months later, that clarity would explode into controversy when Martin Smith, the father, saw footage of Gerry McCann descending the stairs of an airplane with his own son in his arms. He froze. The posture, the way the child rested on the shoulder, the manner of walking, it was, he said, exactly what he had seen that night. He would later tell investigators he was 60 to 80% certain it was the same man. But how could it be? At 9:55 p.m., Gerry McCann had a solid alibi. He was at the tapas restaurant. Witnesses confirmed it and records supported it. And yet the eerie resemblance described by Smith created a storm of speculation that has never truly faded. The question then becomes, were these two sightings connected, or did they represent two completely different men carrying two different children in the same small town on the same night? If they were the same man, then why did it take nearly 40 minutes to walk a distance that should have taken no more than 5 to 7 minutes? If Tanner was mistaken, then her sighting becomes irrelevant, leaving the Smith sighting as the only credible timeline. If both were mistaken, then perhaps the entire foundation of the investigation was built on illusions. But if one of them was right, then the answer to what happened to Madeleine McCann may lie within those 55 minutes between 9:05 and 10 p.m. The stakes could not be higher. For years, the Tanner sighting directed the world's gaze toward a Mediterranean-looking suspect and away from the possibility that someone much closer to home could have been involved. Sketches based on her testimony were circulated globally, while the Smith sighting was largely ignored by investigators and the media. The discrepancy shifted the trajectory of the investigation and perhaps cost invaluable time. And yet, the Smith sighting remains stubborn, consistent, and chilling. 9 witnesses saw it. They described the same thing, and one of them later believed to his core that he had seen a father carrying his own daughter into the night. That is the tragedy of the Madeleine McCann case. Not only the disappearance of a 3-year-old girl, but the confusion, contradictions, and missed opportunities that followed. Two competing sightings, one elevated to global prominence, the other buried in the shadows. And in between them, the truth of what really happened on that warm Portuguese night, still waiting to be uncovered. After hearing about these two conflicting sightings, how do you feel about the official timeline of events that the public has been presented with? If you were tasked with solving this case, which sighting would you put more faith in? And what new steps would you take based on that decision? Thanks for watching. How do you feel about these arguments and theories? Does it give you a different perspective on the case? Leave your thoughts in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to receive the latest notifications.
We can't be certain. You have to speak to those involved. We don't believe for 1 minute that they thought we were involved in Madeleine's disappearance. We think there was tremendous pressure to make the crime go away.